So we're going to be, hopefully, we'll make some more progress into chapter 1 than we did last week. We kind of got off on the side rail, which I meant to, just to kind of get us talking about some things. But we are going to start with verse number 9 here in James 1. And what we talked about up to this point is James is encouraging them to not get discouraged, to seek out their wisdom from God, to learn patience, because that's going to help us become more of a stable person. And he points out in verse 8, a double-minded man is unstable in all of his ways. And we spent basically the last couple of sessions talking about how that looks and works. Y'all got any thoughts or any reflections of anything we talked about the last couple of weeks that we could maybe springboard off of? As we talked a lot about dinosaurs last week.
Yeah.
And, we talked about how a lot of churches are embracing LGBTQ plus stuff in their churches, and that's very double-minded within itself. It could go the other way as well. I think a lot of church members are so focused on the way it used to be that they think that, well, that worked before, so let's just do what we've always done.
Right.
But when you look at your current climate and situation, what you're doing isn't necessarily working anymore. And I think, we had our first church hall, town hall meeting last Sunday night.
Yep.
And most of the things that came out of that were less contemporary music, more traditional music, more Sunday school classes, more of what used to be.
Mm-hmm.
But what that has produced is a lack of the goal, which is to target 30 to 50-year-old couples. So I think that can be just as big of an issue, being double-minded of, okay, let's look at like the Jesus Revolution movie. He was super resistant to any of that initially.
Spoiler.
I'm not.
Oh, we've seen it.
Yeah, they've seen the movie, so that's
I
what.
haven't.
Okay, yeah, you haven't seen it, so I won't spoil the movie for those who haven't seen it and those watching online. But he was very resistant at first because it was different.
Mm-hmm.
It was something he's never done before, something he's not comfortable with. But once he surrendered to it, they started seeing some really amazing things starting to happen.
I like what my commentary says here. This man is a hypocrite who occasionally believes in God but fails to trust him when trials come.
Yeah, that's right. And we're facing a trial as a church.
Mm-hmm.
We need younger people. We need to maybe redirect how we do things, how we attack and approach things. And that takes faith. Of just, even right here within our text, it says, if you ask, it's verse 6, but let him ask in faith, nothing wavering, for he that wavereth is like a wave of the sea driven with the wind and tossed. Or let not that man think he shall receive anything from the Lord. And that's why it says a double-minded man is unstable in all of his ways. So, we've got to just not ask according to our comfort zone, but ask according to God's will and be willing to follow that, whenever we go in that direction, following the Lord's leadership. So moving on into the next part of the passage, because we can probably talk about that for a month, but it says, and here's kind of, I think, where, I think all this ties in perfectly to what we're experiencing right now as a church. It says, let the brother of low degree rejoice in that he is exalted. I think we have to put ourselves aside, and when our preferences are aside, and what makes us comfortable aside, and become humble to the point of saying, because watching The Chosen, the disciples left what they knew to go do something never done before. Peter, we just finished season 1 as a family. We're about to start season 2. We're just watching it at night and having Bible discussions. But Peter's whole thing is, I don't know what I'm doing here. I don't know what I'm supposed to learn. I don't know what I'm supposed to do. Of course, his brothers and Thaddeus, I think it was talking to him one time, and he said, He's chosen us for a reason. We just need to follow his lead and learn from him and do whatever comes next. And that's what we need to do as a church. Even from decade to decade to decade, we have to kind of let go of what we're comfortable with and see what comes next. The trick is finding that balance of what is biblical, what is socially acceptable. You gotta hit a balance somewhere in between. And it's tough to decipher that, to figure that out exactly. And my whole push in North Carolina when we went through this, and it worked. I mean, we grew the church from 20 to over 100 in the time that I was there. And my whole pitch was we need to modernize without compromise. We need to do things in a new way, but without compromising the fundamental truths and doctrines of the Bible. And I think we did a decent job. I mean, we grew the church over 5 times its size in the time that we were there in 7 years. And when we moved back here, I've reconnected with the new pastor who's over there, and he's now remaining with the same 15 or 20 that I started with 15 years ago at this point. Because they stopped, when I left, they stopped doing the things that I was encouraging them to do. And he brought a bunch of people into the church because they had a church but no building. They were meeting at different places, so they all came in, and they ended up doing some of the things that I suggested that they do to continue growing the church even after I left. And they did that at first, but then the core group that doesn't like change, that doesn't like anything new, ended up running all of his people off that he brought into the church. So I think he said maybe one couple that's still left from his original church group that came in because of a certain core that ran even all of those people off.
Wow.
And it's all because they don't want to let go of the things that they're comfortable with. And we've got to do as verse 9 says, of let us be of a low degree, meaning humbling ourselves, not doing things that are pleasing to ourselves, but things that are honorable to God. It says, for when you are of low degree, rejoice in that he is exalted, meaning God will bless it. And then it goes on to say, but the rich in that he is made low, because as the flower of the grass, he shall pass away. The richness, the riches, the wealth, the things that we enjoy in this life will one day cease, because we will die. And we will, go on to our eternity, and there's going to be something new to come along. Things are different now than they were in the 70s.
Mm-hmm.
But the concepts should still be the same. Pastor Chuck, I think was his name in the movie, he, had to let go of himself and embrace what God was trying to do. Here we are, 2023, we still need to do the same thing. And if we're going to grow our church here, we're going to have to do the same things that he did, 50 years ago now? Something like that.
Yep.
So the principles must be the same, even though the techniques and processes may look a little bit different. We really need to reflect on that. We need to, we should have the whole church in here, I guess, listening to this, but we need to get over ourselves and just surrender ourselves to God, because God is eternal and we are not, but his work needs to go on. Whether we're comfortable with the process or not, we need to make sure we're doing things biblically sound, but doing what needs to be done to bring in the people so they can hear the gospel. Went to Joy's concert last night at ETSU, and surprisingly, they sang a lot of songs about going to heaven. But I was sitting there thinking the whole time, just looking and trying not to judge, but hearing some of the stories from how she knows firsthand some of these people, I'm like, there's a large majority of these people standing up here talking about going to Zion and going to heaven, and they're singing a song about soon we're going to be leaving, kind of like a rapture kind of type concept. I was like, probably half of those people up there don't even understand what they're singing. And I kind of wonder if that's not the truth with a lot of churches. A lot of people go to church for the culture. And that's what we got to be careful of is, we can do the things that will attract people to come in, but is that the only reason that they're going to be coming? Because of the things we're doing, and they miss the whole message of the gospel. We got to put that first and foremost in the center of everything that we do. This is why you're here, to learn about Jesus, to put Jesus first, not to produce people who come in and enjoy the food and the fellowship and then go out there and live like the rest of the world the rest of the week. That's the things that I struggle with as a leader in a church personally is how do we do what's biblically sound, yet also still get people to want to come into our building? Because we're a traditional church. We're kind of fighting against that. A lot of people don't like traditional anything. And I've had a lot of conversations over the past week with younger people my age and younger, is why are you going to the church you're going to? What's attracted you there? And a lot of the things that they say are not the things that we do. And I don't know that this church is willing to do those things.
Well, then we have to decide if we're going to promote ourselves as a traditional church,
Right.
or make changes. 'Cause
Exactly.
What we're doing isn't working.
Right.
You either got to
Yeah.
go after that group,
I'll be
Or-
happy with what you got.
Yeah.
but even market to the traditional group.
Which are fewer and far between
Right.
these days. So it's got to come down to this church needs a goal to focus on. And what it sounds like from our first meeting, the goal is to target 30 to 50-year-old couples.
That's where we start.
Not just to get a bunch of kids in here, because we have learned from personal experience that you can bring in all the kids that you want to, but that doesn't necessarily mean their parents are going to show up. But if you get their parents here, unless they just leave their kids at home, they're going to probably bring their kids with them as well. And you accomplish both goals of getting younger couples and kids in. So you got to target those younger couples and what will bring them into the church. Then once you get them there, work with them to, line up with the Bible, I guess. But it's I don't know, it's going to be tough. And the biggest thing it's going to be tough about is what we face in North Carolina is getting the ones who are established here and have been here for 30 to 50 to 60 years, allow things to go the way they need to go to accomplish the goal. We got to keep that goal out in front of us the whole time. This is why we're doing this. Otherwise, people are going to get real uncomfortable real quick, and they're going to be, I don't know about all this.
I work at a place, as you know, has a lot of younger people.
Right.
And it turns over, so I see a lot of people come through. And it's not that they don't proclaim to be a Christian, but they don't go to church.
Right.
And sometimes I feel like work has a lot to do with that. Back in the day when everybody was going to church, things weren't open on Sundays. People
Right.
didn't work on Sundays. Now they think that's their one day a week because they're working on Saturdays.
Yeah,
to
that's my
have
one
some
day
personal
off.
time
Yeah.
and one
So
day
it's-
off.
It's a cultural shift. It
It's-
really has. That's right.
Seriously is.
And there's a lot of other things, we talked about last week, the foundation that's been set. We've started to embrace things that are anti-biblical, and they think that that's acceptable and to be, evolution mixed in with Christianity and creation. That can't be. A lot of people take that, and we've just lost our foundation that everything has been built on, and it's all just kind of been whatever, the last several decades. But let's see what James tells us through all this, if it helps us in any way. So, go back and recap verse 9 and 10. It says, "Let the brother of low degree rejoice in that he is exalted." So the ones who are humble will be lifted up. "But let the rich in that he is made low," or the one who is proud is made humble. "Because as a flower of the grass, he shall pass away. For the sun is no soon risen with a burning heat, but it withereth the grass, and the flower thereof falleth, and the grace of the fashion of it perisheth. So also shall the rich man fade away in his ways. Blessed is the man that endureth temptation, for when he is tried, he shall receive the crown of life, which the Lord hath promised to them that love him." We'll pause there before we move forward. So there's one of those crowns of life or the crowns that are mentioned throughout the Bible. Does anyone remember how many of those are mentioned? I can't think off the top of my head. I think there's 5 or 7, somewhere around there. Those are the crowns that we receive for the things we've done, to get the rewards that 1 Corinthians chapter 3 talks about, that we're given. Of course, we give those crowns back to Jesus, and that's why he's wearing those crowns as he comes back to establish his 1,000-year millennial reign. That all ties together. But this is one of the crowns that we can get, and it says the way we get this, it says, blessed is the man that endureth temptation. What did James start off this chapter by saying? In verse 2, it says, count it all joy when you fall into divers temptations. And that word temptation can also be translated as trials. Does anybody have in verse 12, endureth temptation? Does that say trials in any of your verses?
Temptation.
Says that endures these temptations, for when he is tried, he shall receive the crown of life. So that is, we face these temptations, we face these trials, we yield ourselves to God through them. That actually is giving us a reward, a crown of life, as the Bible tells it. Again, remember who's writing this book. Who's writing this book? Who was James? Jesus' half-brother, exactly. So he was very close to Jesus. So I kind of like that. We can really put a little extra perspective on what he's saying here, being a blood relative to Jesus, if you want to call it that, to Jesus Christ. That's kind of interesting. What was you going to say?
I was going to say, but that's 2 different meanings if you read, blessed is the man who endures trials versus the man who endures temptation.
Right. So, and going back to the way I tried to portray it in verse 2, when we go through a trial, I think the temptation is there to not yield to God, to give up in a way, to say, oh, what's the point of doing it? I'm trying my best to live the way I should, and I keep facing these trials. Mm-hmm. I keep having these bad things happen to me. What's the point? A lot of people do that, and then they just start living for the world. In a sense, I think the temptation and the trial are kind of one and the same. But yeah, it would change kind of the perspective of that depending on how you view that as either a temptation or a trial. I kind of think they're the same thing in a way, but if you separated them out,
it can be. But I mean, you're tempted when things aren't going bad too.
Right.
So it would be a different.
So, and he clarifies. Let's kind of continue. Might give us a little context. So, verse 13 says, "Let no man say when he is tempted." So he uses the word tempted 4 times in this one verse. So I think this does go back to a temptation in context. It says, "Let no man say when he is tempted, I am tempted of God. For God cannot be tempted with evil, neither tempteth he any man." There's a lot of debate over this one verse. I mean, what do we make of that? We can get the idea that God cannot be tempted with evil. Was he tempted with evil? Kind of.
Yeah.
Jesus was tempted in the wilderness,
Mm-hmm.
but he passed the test.
Right.
So what do we make of that? It's an interesting verse. It says God cannot be tempted with evil. What do you think, Zach? What do you think that means? Can God be tempted with evil?
No.
He says no.
I guess it depends if you're saying tempted is meaning.
To partake of.
Yeah, if you're saying that, then
Which is what Jesus faced.
right, exactly.
Make these
He
stones
was
be made
tempted.
bread.
I mean, he was
Right.
given a temptation. Maybe that's the way. I don't know.
He was given the opportunity.
You're right.
Yet, I don't think it was possible for him to have sinned. That's another big debate. Could Jesus have made the choice to sin? That's one of the biggest debates that I've faced over the years. A lot of people say yes because he was human. But I say no because he was God. There's no way that God can sin. God is light, and in him is no darkness at all.
That'd be a good one to get the answer on
Yeah.
when we meet him.
Exactly. Could he have?
Well,
I don't think he could have, otherwise he wouldn't have been
I
God.
think he could have, because he was God first.
Right. And then
he
became
was-
human.
Yeah, so he could overtake
But he
any
went
of those
through
human feelings.
everything that humans
So
do.
that he could relate to us. He experienced the emotion and the feelings, and he experienced the temptation. He says he was tempted at all points like as we are, yet without spot. Meaning he was
100%. I'm on board there.
Yeah.
I'm on board with
So
that.
Jesus was tempted as a human. And I don't know if they try to separate that out in Scripture of this is Jesus the man who was tempted at all points so that he can relate to us, yet he never sinned a single time. Or were they referring to the God part of who he was? That's a deep kind of question to get into. But according to James, it says that God is not tempted with evil. And his point of that is saying this: neither does God tempt us with evil. A lot of people go off the rails with that. You know, a lot of people will say, well, you know, God allowed this person to come into my life, therefore he put that temptation in front of me. And that's not biblically accurate. A lot of people blame God because, well, he's the one that gave me this job, and this job is what made me to work so many hours, and then I spent less time with my family, and then my marriage fell apart, and since I was there, God allowed this woman to come into my life, and I went in this direction, and now I'm in the situation I'm in. People do this. Of course, I wrote that whole book, Don't Blame God, to try to counteract that, but a lot of people do try to tie that back to, well, God allowed this. What would be y'all's response to that?
Why don't they ever blame Satan?
There you go. Why don't they ever blame the devil? Because
Yeah.
the devil is the root of all, of all this.
Well,
The
sometimes
source
the
of
devil
it.
gives us so many things on our plate to see if we do get distracted by
Right.
one over the other. Because with school right now, I'm juggling 50 hours at the music department, 12 hours teaching, working as a manager at Food City, and still trying
Yeah.
to find time to spend time with y'all. And so,
And
I've got
Evan.
a lot on my plate, and Evan, and it's been hard, but I just know that it's not God's fault.
Right.
It's just how life is.
And I think
Just,
go ahead.
No, I'm just going to say, it just depends if you believe in permissive will or predestination.
Right.
Because if you believe in predestination, then they're thinking that God did do that. But if you don't, and you believe that he lets us make those choices,
Right.
then how is it him?
Right. And I think it definitely ties back to verses 2, 3, and 4 of count it all joy when you fall into this situation. It says, because know this, the trying of your faith works patience, and let patience have its perfect work, that you may be perfect and entire, wanting nothing. I think God will allow these things to come into our life so that we can find a way to balance it, still keeping him first in everything, and in doing so, we become a stronger Christian as a result, if we don't go off the rails in the process. And James also addresses this in verses 14 and 15. I've got it circled in my Bible because this is big. It says, but every man is tempted when. So this is important to pay attention to. It's not God tempting us. Not necessarily even Satan tempting us, according to James. It says, but let every man that is tempted, when he is drawn away, or every man is tempted, when he is drawn away of his own lust and enticed. A lot of these temptations come from within our own desires to be better, to have more, to whatever. What happened with Eve. I mean, this all ties back to the original situation. Eve looked upon what Satan presented in front of her. God put it there, put the tree of knowledge of good and evil in the garden. They saw it. God placed it there so that they could choose not to partake in it. Satan then came to her and said, did God really mean that? Is that really what God said? And got her questioning it. And then she looked at it and said, well, according to that, that's going to make me a wiser person, better person. I'm going to be like God. It's going to make me better.
She rationalized it.
She rationalized it, and her lust, in that case, was wanting something more for herself, which is what happened to Satan. He said, I will be like God. I will ascend upon his throne. I will be like the Most High. He wanted something more. So it does kind of start from within ourselves of wanting more than maybe God wants for us in that moment. It's not that God's not going to give it to us eventually, or maybe he's not going to give, maybe he'll never give me $1 million because he knows I can't handle it. I don't know. But just because you desire something doesn't mean you need to go after it. I wish the young people would get a hold of that because of this whole transgender movement. Oh, if I was just a different gender, I would be who I'm supposed to be. If I was just this, then this would make me perfectly happy. If I could just have this surgery or whatever, it's going to make me complete it. That's a person's own lust, and that entices them to partake of whatever it is that they're going after. It says, then when lust has conceived, I like that, for that word conceived. When a baby's conceived, what happens?
It starts to grow.
Starts to grow and develop into whatever it's going to become. That's the way these temptations can be in our life. When lust has conceived, it's rooted in there, it begins to grow and to turn into something. It says when it's conceived, it brings forth sin. And sin, when it is finished, brings forth death. So James tells us the root of our demise is not necessarily the devil. It could just be our own decisions. And that goes back to predestination versus permissive will versus just our will. I mean, God's given us the free will to do what we choose with our lives, and many people are doing that these days, and it's ending up destroying their lives in so many ways.
And even beyond the example you gave, the younger generation seems to feel entitled.
Oh, yeah.
They're owed so much. You laughing because you agree or disagree?
Well, there's this girl specifically in the Bells Choir last night who felt very entitled and oversang everybody else. And she, when we were rehearsing for this song called Warrior, it's like a women empowerment deal, she said women's rights are literally being taken away, so we need to be more passionate about it. And I just
Of course, she's
shook my
talking about
head.
abortion.
And
is what she was talking
Okay.
about.
That's what I'm
like
saying.
because they're trying to illegalize abortion, and she's like, that's women's rights being taken. Like, she feels entitled to the right to murder a baby. And it's just, I see that a lot at ETSU. People feel entitled to like force their opinion on other people.
And that does just seem to be a younger generational thing.
I was taught to
Right.
stand behind and be quiet.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And these kids are taught, get out in front and make
Yeah.
a scene.
Yeah.
That's honestly what they're taught.
Yeah.
Throw tantrums till they get their way.
Yeah, till they get their way. And that's why we're seeing the left
100%.
act the way that they're acting. And I have been on this soapbox literally for at least 15 years. I've told this to all my peers. I've seen these kids walk graduation stage. They can't even write a complete sentence and barely sign their name, yet we're graduating them from high school. And my whole pitch has been, we are setting these kids up for eternal damnation by the whole No Child Left Behind Act. And now it's called something else. And we're just passing. I get the point of the No Child Left Behind in that we need to reach them all. But we know in reality, those in education, that's not what happens. We just thin down education. We dumb it down so everybody can pass. And we just pass them along. The classes are so thin that you can't go super deep. And you got some students that you can go really deep with. Me and Zachary have talked about this. He's pretty solid, not because he's my kid, but he's the strongest kid in my engineering class. He solves more problems than anybody else as far as ideas coming up with. And if I had a room full of kids like him, We'd be sending rockets to Mars, type thing. But since I have other kids that I have to like constantly get in your seat, go back to your group, just chase them around the room trying to keep them contained. That's what's happening in education. We say in the education world that those two students are equal. We're going to pass them both equally. And we've just given every kid a trophy, as the phrase has been said. You get a trophy for last place, and you get a trophy for first place. And the kid who gets the trophy for last place, studies have shown they actually feel guilty and bad about themselves because they know they didn't deserve it. But now I think we're approaching a generation where they do feel they deserve it because they've been given everything all of their life. And now they're just so bold to expect it. And my whole pitch has been, when these kids die, and some of them die as teenagers or 20-year-olds or whatever, and they stand before God, they're going to expect God will just let them into heaven. Because that's how they've been taught their entire life. They haven't been taught, you have a problem called sin, you are a sinner, and God can't have anything to do with you until you get right with God through Jesus.
When people do try to
They haven't heard this.
When people do try to tell them that they're sinners, they're like, oh, you're
Well,
just
you're judging
homophobic or
Yeah.
judgmental or
And
stuff
they've
like
come up
that.
with all this new vocabulary to keep us from saying things like that so that they can feel better about themselves. And we're in a mess as a society. It's ridiculous.
You can ask my kids, not necessarily the examples there, but all you have to do is say, what's the word consequences mean to you? And they'll tell you about sermons that they've heard from their dad.
Right. Yeah.
Because there
uh,
is.
Yeah, there's a consequence for it. There's good consequences and bad consequences.
Exactly.
It came to the point that our son used to hate to come into the house because we like family meeting time.
Right.
We'd be like,
All right, family gathering.
yeah. He knew what that meant.
Was kind of like, one of our, probably not a good movie, but one of our favorite movies, mine and Lori's favorite movies is, what's that movie with the dancers?
Step Up?
Step Up. Yeah, for some reason we've just always liked that movie. It's got Tatum Channing in it.
Channing Tatum.
Channing Tatum. I can't always get his name. He's got two last names, or two first names as far as I'm concerned. What's his name?
Channing Tatum.
Channing Tatum. Anyway, he got in trouble in the movie because he destroyed some property, and it happened to be at a school of the arts. So the judge says you've got to serve your sentences to do community service hours at the scene of the crime. So he walks in, he's sitting in the principal's office, and she's looking at him, and he's just kind of sitting there like, let's get this over with. And she's like, you have no idea the consequences of your actions, do you? He's like, yeah, 200 hours. Meaning he's going to serve 200 hours of community service. Didn't even think and she's like, no, this could cost a person the equivalent of the money that the money's going to cost to fix the issue was the equivalent of 1 year of scholarship money for a kid that now can't go to school there because they got to spend that money to replace the stuff he tore up. And he was like, oh well. He was like, people make dumb decisions all the time type thing. And he just didn't get the concept. Eventually, by the end of the movie, he understood it through the things that he went through. But that's the way youth are today. They just, how does it affect me? They don't care about how it affects anybody else. How am I going to get better because of this? What can I gain out of this? What am I personally going to have to suffer because of this? But they don't get that this affects them eternally. This affects them in so many other ways. But James gets right to it. He's like, if you are going to be tempted, it's a lot of the times going to be because of your own decisions, your own desires, your own lust, as he calls it. You're enticed by that. And it says, when lust is conceived, it brings forth sin, and sin, when it's finished with you, basically is what it's saying, it brings forth death. It says, do not err, my beloved brethren. Again, who's he talking to? He's talking to the scattered, verse number 1, the Jews, people in general who are running because of their faith in Christ. That's who he's addressing. When he says brethren, he's talking about those who are facing persecution, those believers in Jesus who are facing these things that are coming upon them. It says, do not err, my beloved brethren. Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above, and cometh down from the Father of lights, meaning the creator of the heavens and everything that we see. Lights meaning stars and the sun and all that. with whom is no variableness, neither shadow of turning. Of his own will begat he us with the word of truth, that we should be a kind of first fruits of his creatures, or of his creation. So what he's saying here is the good things that you gain from life are gifts from God. That's how we should see them. A lot of people see that as, I earned it. You know, I built this fortune. I built this life. I did this. No, God gave you the ability to do so it's really from God. And then people try to make it a coin, I guess, and say, well, if God gives me all these good things, then God also gives me all these bad things. The same source. If God's permitting all of these things, or if it's predestination, however you want to put it, then this all must be God's doing, whether it's good or bad. James is separating the two. He's saying the good things in life are gifts from God. They're blessings that God is allowing you to enjoy if you're putting Him first in your life, is kind of the point. But the bad things that come in your life, they may be scenarios that were presented to you, but because of the trial, I think that's where we get into the trial versus the temptation. God, I think, will permit trials to come into our life, but He's not the source of the temptation. When a trial comes up, let's say just a marital thing, someone comes into your life, maybe God does allow a person to come into your life just to give you the opportunity to shove that away and say, no, I'm putting my marriage first and I'm putting God first in this situation. The trial is not necessarily the temptation. The trial is a opportunity to make a right choice. But when the temptation roots in, that's our own desires getting in the way of God's desires for us in that moment, if you kind of want to look at it that way. A lot of people have a hard time splitting that, splitting hairs, as they say, of separating the trial versus the temptation. But he's clearly saying the temptations that lead towards sin and leads toward death are of your own desires and the things that you want for yourself, which is what Satan did and caused him to fall from being Lucifer to becoming Satan. That's what Eve did that caused the fall of all humanity. And that's what we still do in this day as we face it. Because that tree sitting in the Garden of Eden, why, and this is what atheists always argue, why did God put that tree in the Garden of Eden if He knew what they were going to do? That's one of the biggest debate items I've ever heard by atheists is this, God did this because God put it there, so it's His fault. He knew she was going to do that. So this is God's doing. No, God put the tree there. Why? Why did God put the tree of knowledge of good and evil in the garden?
So we'd have a choice.
So you'd have a choice to
Do the right thing.
choose Him versus choosing ourselves. That's the trial. The temptation is we begin to look at that trial and say, what can I get out of this? Not what can God get out of this, but what can I get out of this? And that's where we start going down the wrong path.
If the choice wasn't ever there, you'd be kind of like a robot.
Yeah, exactly.
Create a robot. The robot's at your will.
Yeah, what would be the point of God creating us if He's not going to give us the choice to choose Him? Like he said, it would just be robotic entities that are just, and even angels. Angels have a choice to either remain as they are
absolutely.
or turn away from God and choose themselves. That's what this all boils down to, and that's what James is getting at, is you've got gifts from God that you can partake of if you choose Him, or you've got sin and death coming your way, however you want to apply that, if you choose yourself. That's what the choice is. Choose yourself or choose God. That's what it all boils down to. And he says, in verse 18, he says, of His own will begat He us with the word of truth. So it's His will that we take the truth, we take His word, that we should be a kind of first fruits of His creatures. Can't say that. So what do you think that means? What does the first fruits of His creatures mean to you? What does creature mean? A creation, right? God has created us so that we're a creature, right? Mark even said, preach the gospel to every creature. I don't think he meant to the snails and bugs on the ground. I think he meant to everybody who is a creation. What's first fruits mean?
First generation, I don't know.
So we see that word first fruits being used a lot throughout the Bible, even in the tithing realm. First fruits means the best of.
Oh, okay.
Like if we get a basket of apples, what do we do usually?
Cull them.
Right, we go through and pick out the best ones and set them to the side, and the bad ones, maybe I'll deal with those later, or maybe I'll toss them.
Or do a jam.
Yeah, or do a jam, or turn it into something else. So what this is meaning is God intends for us the best that life has to offer, the first fruits of His creatures, and that is God's will. But the only way for us to experience that is to partake of the word of truth. That is the Bible, that's the message of Jesus, that's what God wants and desires for us. And He's given us all kinds of examples, and I've given us some examples of how if we follow ourselves, that's not going to be what we end up with. We're going to end up with corruption, we're going to end up with sin, we're going to end up with chaos. And that explains the world in a nutshell, that we look around us today in 2023 and see they've not chosen the word of truth, and they're certainly not receiving the first fruits of what God wants for us. They're a result of their own choices.
Then they turn into Sam Smith.
And then they turn into Sam Smith, exactly. All right, we'll close with that. It's the 10 till anyway, so we'll see you all next week. We'll pick up with verse 19 as we continue in James chapter 1.